Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. The ocean was calm and serene at first. The sky adorned with thousands of stars stretched endlessly, and the Atlantic's boundless blue made Stephen Callahan feel free. With his self-designed boat, Napoleon Solo, he was determined to push his limits and cross the Atlantic. The gentle breeze filled the sails, and the boat glided smoothly over the water, but the sea, whenever it appeared peaceful, always hid a storm behind it. Around midnight, the weather began to change. First, the wind shifted, then gradually increased in strength, howling around the boat. Dark clouds appeared on the horizon, signaling the arrival of a storm. Callahan tried to adjust the sails to keep the boat under control, but the sea was rising rapidly. The waves hit harder and harder, each strike causing the boat to rock more violently. Within minutes, the sky had completely darkened. Lightning illuminated the ocean's dark surface with fleeting flashes, while the wind howled like a screaming ghost, making it difficult for Callahan to breathe. The raindrops hit his face with such force that they blurred his vision. As the waves grew bigger, they began tossing the boat around like a toy. At that moment, a sudden blow changed everything. With a deafening crash, the boat shook violently. Callahan lost his balance and fell to the floor. Before he could process what had happened, the cold Atlantic water rushed inside. The boat's starboard side was torn open, and water flooded in rapidly. His heart raced. In a panic, he tried to get up, but another wave tilted the boat. The water level was rising quickly. His reflexes kicked in. Taking a deep breath, he scrambled to reach the emergency supplies inside the boat. By feel, he found the flashlight, but his trembling hands struggled to turn it on. The water had already passed his knees. Time was running out. In that moment, years of sailing knowledge kicked in. He had to stay calm. He worked with all his strength to deploy the emergency raft. He managed to pull the yellow raft from the back of the boat and drop it into the water. But there was a problem. The most vital survival supplies were still trapped inside the sinking boat. Summoning all his courage, he dove into the water. As he searched the boat for the emergency bag, the surrounding water turned into a swirling, blurry vortex. Struggling to hold his breath, he grabbed the bag and fought to swim upward. Suddenly, his foot snagged on something. With a frantic effort, he freed himself and made it to the surface, gasping for air. With one final move, he reached the raft and climbed aboard. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe. He ran his hands through his hair and wiped the salty water from his face. In the middle of the ocean, he was left alone on a small raft. As Napoleon Solo sank into the depths of the ocean, the sky flashed with lightning. The storm was still raging, but Callahan now faced an entirely different battle: survival in the open sea. Stephen Callahan, uncertain and vulnerable, leaned against his raft in the middle of the vast ocean. His eyes focused on the distant horizon, but every time he looked, all he saw was the same endless blue. His entire world consisted of the surrounding ocean and the small raft he was clinging to. At first, the basic hardships like hunger and thirst didn't strike him with immediate severity. He glanced at the raft. How minimal was his equipment? Apart from a few essential items, there was almost nothing. A hunting rifle, some canned food, a water purification device, and a few signaling flares that might save his life. Right now, all of these supplies might be his only hope for survival. However, with each passing day, he had to use more of them. At first, using the water purification device carefully, he drank rainwater he collected. As the days passed, the amount of water and food started to dwindle. He tried to organize the raft, aiming to use everything as efficiently as possible. But this effort was not enough to overcome his struggles with hunger and thirst. After the storm, the ocean calmed. But this stillness brought with it a much greater enemy: heat and dehydration. The raft was mostly exposed to the scorching sunlight, and everything around him seemed to get hotter. As the hours passed, the air began to feel almost like an oven. Callahan's body was drenched in sweat. His eyes were bloodshot from the effects of the salty water, and he felt as though his tongue would swallow itself from the intense thirst. The raft offered only a small, confined space. The hunting rifle and bullets beside him were his last chance for survival. Though he was alone, he began to feel that he was nearing the end of everything. Yet it was nearly impossible to predict how much longer he could endure in the vastness of the ocean. Every moment, something was slipping away. The food was running out, the drinking water was diminishing, and his thoughts were turning into a pile of bleak questions. Every hour of the day was a struggle. As the days went on, his body grew weaker from hunger and thirst. At first, his body thought it could manage the limited food supply, but now everything was different. In the evenings, as darkness began to fall, fatigue became even more overwhelming. He often lost himself in deep thought, staring into the vast ocean. But then for a moment, when he felt the intensity of the waves or thought about the burning heat of the sun, he would remind himself once again that he had to stay alive. Night brought another challenge. After the scorching day, a freezing cold began. Spending the night on the small raft was nearly impossible. He had very few things to cover himself with. The blankets he wrapped around himself for warmth weren't very helpful. His skin was constantly in contact with the wet, cold wind, and his muscles were aching severely. He was not merely confined to an enclosed space, but was instead lying, exposed in the middle of the ocean. The depths of the ocean seemed ready to swallow him at any moment. Sometimes, as he stared blankly at the water in front of him, he felt a need for change. Loneliness could take a person to a very different place. Callahan would occasionally close his eyes and drift into memories of the past. His family, his friends, and most importantly, his knowledge of sailing. All these things gave him some measure of comfort. At the same time, he couldn't help but wonder whether this knowledge and skill would be strong enough to keep him alive. Each passing day, however, felt like another loss. Being alone in the middle of the ocean was becoming a reality that he had to accept more with each passing day. The difference between days, hours, and minutes seemed irrelevant. He struggled to hold on to even one memory correctly, yet every passing minute made the battle to hold on to life even harder. Water and food were running out, and the salty air and exhaustion quickly overtook him. The raft had become not just a lifeline but a transition zone. The ocean was both his greatest enemy and his only hope for survival, and with each passing day, no one could predict what would happen at the end of this struggle. Stephen Callahan had begun the toughest battle of his life in the middle of the ocean. His body grew weaker by the day, and his mind was overwhelmed with dark thoughts. Hunger and thirst had become his greatest enemies from the very beginning. Yet his intelligence and limited resources were the things keeping him alive. To survive in the ocean, he had to be creative. Even a single mistake could lead to the end. At first, collecting rainwater seemed like the basic way to find a healthy drinking source. Callahan decided to set up a makeshift system using the simple materials available on the raft. He stretched a nylon tarp to collect the water, placing a few containers underneath to create a basic channel. Rain, though rare, was precious for his survival. When a few drops gathered, it gave him a glimmer of hope. But unfortunately, this was never enough. The rainwater could only provide temporary relief for his thirst. Still, every drop of water was the cornerstone of his long-term survival. Food was becoming more critical with each passing day. The canned food was gone, and the only things left were the hunting rifle and the spear. The rifle was probably something to be used as a last resort. Using it would not be as simple as shooting prey on the surface of the water. With limited ammunition, missing a target would be a luxury he couldn't afford. So the spear seemed like a more efficient and silent solution. At first, using the spear was difficult. Targeting slow-moving fish wasn't easy. Every attempt he made ended in failure. However, as the days spent on the ocean passed, he learned patience. He carefully prepared his spear and waited for hours to find the right angle. Within a few days, he began to learn how to catch fish slowly. Each fish ensured his survival for one more day. However, finding prey was never easy. The ocean sometimes seemed like it was made up only of empty spaces. Only hours spent with patience and attention could bring him the next sip of water or bite of food. Amidst all these struggles, there was another looming threat: sharks. Callahan could feel something beneath the surface of the water, watching him. In his mind, the question of how he would survive among these dangers constantly echoed. Every whale or shark that approached the raft triggered both fear and his survival instincts. The ocean was becoming increasingly dangerous with every passing day. Sharks had grown so accustomed to hunting that a stationary fish beneath the surface became an easy target for them. Callahan knew he had to approach the edges of the sea carefully, always aware of the looming danger. One day a shark became distinctly visible near the raft. Callahan, lifting his head above the water, spotted it by carefully scanning the surroundings. It was a large gray silhouette. Though it appeared to be blending with the other fish, its eyes were focused on him. In that moment, he could feel the cold breath of death. Instinctively, he acted. With only a few seconds of caution, he decided not to move away from the raft but instead to direct it to a safer position. Slowly, he gathered his spear and hunting rifle. He hid them inside the raft, waiting patiently for the shark to surface. But Callahan knew he couldn't stay still any longer. Every moment on the ocean felt like a game where the stakes were his life. Mentally exhausted, something deep inside him urged him not to give up. Being alone in the vast ocean sometimes pushed a person to their limits, but still, he clung to the hope that one day these harsh conditions would present him with an opportunity. As his mental state began to deteriorate, his survival instincts began to help him even more. He carefully positioned himself in deeper waters, farther away from the shark, trying to feel safer. Because he wasn't just battling the ocean, he was also fighting an internal darkness. Both his body and mind were continuing the fight for survival. The infinity of the ocean created both a sense of hope and a feeling of deep despair. Stephen Callahan searched for a glimmer of hope with every sunrise, but each passing day added loneliness and hunger to the mix. Looking at the emptiness around him from his raft, he constantly found himself in the midst of a struggle. Even though each new day began, he faced the same challenges, and every evening he fell asleep with the same exhaustion. But there was one thing. His survival instincts always gave him one more chance. One day his eyes caught movement in the distance. A ship appeared as a silhouette on the horizon. Callahan's heart began to race. After all the time he had spent in the ocean, seeing a ship gave him a renewed sense of hope. In that moment, he thought everything was about to change and that he would finally be rescued. He quickly grabbed his flare gun and, shaking with anticipation, fired a flare into the sky. Once again, he realized just how far everything was in the vast ocean. But perhaps this was his final chance. The flare shot up with lightning speed, bursting into the sky in a purple light. That light symbolized a hope. He imagined the ship approaching, noticing him, and coming to his aid. However, a minute later, the ship disappeared beyond the horizon. Despite the flare's bright light, the ship continued on its course, and Callahan's hopes instantly crumbled. The ship vanished as a distant silhouette, and Callahan felt his heart racing, realizing that nothing had changed in that moment. He remained still for a while. The ocean was so calm and deep that it seemed to absorb all the emotions he was feeling. He once again felt abandoned, helpless, in the ocean's embrace. A ship, a flare, maybe the last hope, but nothing had happened. Callahan began to feel not just that moment, but every moment on the raft. Days made him reflect on how long time could feel, yet in reality, only hours were passing. He stared at the ocean in silence for a while. In that moment, loneliness, hunger, and fear were all intertwined, but an inner voice told him not to lose his will to survive. If he wanted to stay alive, he had to keep fighting, no matter what. Being in the middle of the ocean was like a constant test. Mental resilience was not just limited by physical boundaries, but emotional and spiritual ones as well. Callahan was not only fighting to survive every day, but also striving to maintain his mental health. At this point, to cope with the loneliness he was experiencing, he had started talking to himself. Keeping a journal provided him with an emotional outlet. He wanted to see himself not as a desperate man alone with the ocean, but as someone fighting for life. Every day he wrote something in his raft, putting his thoughts on paper. Understanding the struggles and battles he faced was a way of creating meaning in those moments. The notes he wrote to himself not only provided him with direction, but also gave him a form of immunity. His journals symbolized an emotional grip. When life seemed meaningless, his writings gave him, even if momentarily, a sense of balance. Hunger was growing heavier with each passing day. Food was running out and the water supplies were dwindling. Everywhere on the raft he was trying to do something to survive. He realized that keeping his mind busy was more important than developing new strategies. Otherwise, each passing moment would create an emptiness, and his hope for survival would vanish. Fishing with his spear, as difficult as it was, kept his mind alert. His self-reminders and rational planning made the survival process a little more sustainable. However, these strategies couldn't push back his despair and his constant battle with himself. The days felt like weeks. On the raft, alone with the boundless vastness of the ocean and its loneliness, he found himself renewing his survival strategies every day. The flare, though a symbol of brief hope, was in reality a glimmer of hope after great pain and loss. The next day, the ocean would again call with the same depth and emptiness. But Callahan, even with the fleeting hope that had vanished, was determined to continue this fight with his will to survive. Because one thing had become clear. In this dark ocean, no matter what, life was giving him another chance. As Stephen Callahan continued his struggle for survival in the middle of the ocean, both his body and soul were being exhausted. With each passing day, he grew weaker. The ocean was taking more and more from him. As a man fighting to survive with his inner strength, every reaction from his body brought him closer to his limits. The depletion of his physical strength also affected his morale. Throughout the long time spent on the raft, loneliness and hunger were rapidly shaking the balance of his body and mind. However, this situation hadn't pushed him into complete surrender. One morning, before the sun had even risen, his body felt like an immense burden. His muscles ached, and even taking a step had become harder. Just opening his eyes and taking a deep breath felt precious enough to give him strength. No matter how difficult it was, he had to continue surviving, because there was no other outcome to this struggle. The only way to survive was to gather his remaining strength and repair the raft. However, the raft could no longer hold up. Slowly it began to deteriorate, losing its integrity due to the scorching heat of the sun and the impact of the waves. When Callahan realized that the raft was beginning to rot, a wave of fear washed over him. He felt trapped in this small wooden structure, limited by its safety. With each wave, the ocean was breaking the raft down, causing it to deteriorate further. The nylon covers stretched across the raft had melted from the sun's heat, and the water collection systems were largely damaged. The fundamental components of the rainwater collection system were broken, and finding drinking water had become the biggest obstacle to his survival. Yet, despite all these challenges, Callahan refused to give up. His will to survive was teaching him to keep fighting. Weak and exhausted, he moved around the raft, deciding to spend his remaining energy on repairs. He knew he had to do something to maintain the structural integrity of the raft. It was incredibly difficult to repair things with the limited materials he had in the middle of the ocean. However, this situation didn't discourage him. Instead, it made him more determined. This battle, which went on for days, brought Callahan to the brink of both physical and mental exhaustion. As he tried to repair part of the raft, hunger and thirst continued to consume him. With each passing moment, another blow was dealt to his exhausted body. But on the other hand, his desire to keep fighting kept him motivated. Mentally, he knew he had to do whatever it took to succeed. The ocean seemed like an enemy, but he also had a chance to win against it. A storm decided to test Callahan's resilience one last time. Suddenly, the ocean once again showed its fury. High waves, strong winds, and dark clouds combined to turn everything into a disaster. The waves struck every side of the raft, tossing it around, and water began seeping under the raft, filling it. Callahan struggled to prevent further damage to the raft, while also fighting to secure the covers on his head. He felt that everything was spiraling out of control, and that he didn't have the strength to handle it. The raft seemed like it was on the verge of falling apart. After the storm passed, the raft was badly damaged. Under a dark sky, Callahan realized everything was in ruins. But without a moment's pause, he used the remaining energy he had to repair his raft. The despair of a man lost in the ocean had, even if just a little, turned into a struggle for survival. There was a spark of victory in his eyes, because at last he had used his last remaining resource for his life once again. Every challenge the ocean presented, every storm and wave, wore him down a little more, but his fighting spirit kept him standing tall. He was doing everything he could to win his own survival battle. He kept fishing. Small catches were like victories in those moments, because every fish gave him one more chance to live. The raft had once again provided him with a way to survive, but it was no easy path. His body was nearly exhausted. But Callahan knew one thing: no matter what, he would continue fighting for survival in the middle of the ocean. Even though he was getting weaker every day, every morning, life offered him one more chance. This was not just a battle for survival. It was the very fight for life against death, pushing the limits of what a person could endure. After drifting in the endless ocean for 76 days, Stephen Callahan finally encountered a miracle. Every passing day, the weakening of his body, the struggle with hunger and thirst, had brought his morale to the brink of collapse. In the middle of the ocean, loneliness was slowly swallowing him, and each wave and every day deepened the pain of the previous one. Every moment of being close to death, every new day, was like a battle to survive. But there was something inside him that gave him hope to live: determination. His effort and resilience to survive in the ocean had turned him into something more than a man, a survival machine. All that remained was the instinct to survive. Physically drained, yet mentally still fighting, he grew weaker each day but never gave up. The survival instinct within him told him he had to stay in the ocean longer. His body was covered in wounds, his muscles were weak, but his mind somehow kept him going. It was time for one last fight to keep himself alive. One morning, as his eyes slowly opened, he noticed a movement in the distance. Was it a ship or a fishing boat? He tried to sit up slowly, but his body was so weak that he could barely lift himself. The boat cutting through the ocean's silence became the only thing that reignited Callahan's hope. He was staring so far that his vision blurred, but the instinct to survive drove him to act once again. With his last bit of strength, he fired the flare. A bright light lit up the sky, and he saw that the boat was heading in the right direction. The fishing boat was coming toward Callahan. At that moment, everything changed. His mind, after years of struggle, found some relief for a brief second. Throughout all this time, a man who had managed to survive in the ocean was finally being noticed by another person. The fisherman's boat was rapidly shortening the distance between them. Callahan's injured body now seemed like a mere shell, but he was still alive. It was a miracle. He had survived so long in isolation and despair that the approaching boat felt like a reward for his resilience during this entire process. When the boat reached him, the fisherman examined him in astonishment. His body was incredibly weak, almost completely covered in wounds. His eyes no longer looked like those of a person clinging to life, but rather like those of a soul. They couldn't believe he was still alive. As they brought him onto the boat, they carefully gave him water and food. As Callahan drank the water, his body began to revive a little. Slowly sipping the water gave him the strength to keep surviving. The food began to slowly heal a body ravaged by hunger. The fisherman immediately set course to take Callahan to a hospital for medical attention. This man, who had emerged from the depths of the ocean, arrived on land completely exhausted. Hours later, he was brought to the hospital, where the experts did everything they could to treat him. Callahan's survival was considered a medical miracle. Doctors said his chances of surviving were almost zero, but what had kept him alive throughout this time was his determination and perseverance. As days passed, Callahan's body began to heal slowly. His journey across the ocean was over, but the scars he carried, both physically and mentally, were profound. The fight for survival had transformed him, not only physically, but also mentally. Tired but resilient, fragile yet incredibly strong, the man who had been dragged along for 76 days fighting hunger and thirst was finally beginning to live again as a human. Salvation had not only renewed his body, but also reborn his soul. However, this journey had not only made Callahan a survival expert, it had also made him realize how fragile life is, yet how incredibly valuable it is. This experience had left indelible marks on Callahan's spirit, but it had also taught him how important it is to survive and live without falling into despair. This miraculous rescue had changed his life, both physically and mentally,